Thanks, Reefa. I'm Michelle. I'm a co-founder of My Favorite Hello with my fabulous partner, Samantha. And I'll tell you the story of how we started, if I can manage this.
When you've got Asperger's syndrome, all of the regular emotions like nervousness, tension, or whatever when you go on a date are exacerbated very strongly, because Asperger's tends to do that. It tends to make you experience emotions a lot more than maybe a non-Asperger's person might. So that's how it affects your nerves. Then, of course, you can't read people, so you sit there and you're trying to make conversation, but you can't figure out if what you're saying is interesting to the other person, if they're even enjoying the date or whatever, because normal facial expressions and motion and body language and things like that don't occur naturally to you, so you can't really pick those kinds of things up. And also, just getting to the date is one of the hardest parts. There aren't that many opportunities available to you, hard to make introductions and things like that. Meeting people can be hard, and so can starting conversations with people that will lead to, can you go on a date with me? So yeah, I'd say that those are primarily the main reasons why it's so difficult to date when you've got Asperger's.
James has Asperger's. James is my brother. He's absolutely fabulous. He's 26 and he's never been kissed. And he is desperate for a relationship, but it's a social hurdle that he just can't overcome. And our audience, I'll just go into a little bit about our audience and the condition that they have. Our audience is people with Asperger's, autism, and learning disabilities. Now, it's way oversimplifying, and I really hope that I'm not offending anyone in the audience, but if we think about it this way, people with autism, if we think about them with autistic spectrum disorder, on the high-functioning end of the spectrum, we have people with Asperger's, and on the low-functioning end of the spectrum, we have an overlap with people who have learning disabilities. Now, everybody's different. The condition is not the same in everybody. It manifests in different ways. But the one common thread that runs through each of those groups is that they really struggle socially to make successful social connections. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be because it's difficult to make eye contact with people. It's sensory overload really makes it difficult to carry on a conversation if you're in a crowded place. You have to be in just the right setting for some people. For other people, it's focusing very intensely on one topic or a series of topics and not being able to move past those topics. It's really just social connections are, in a lot of instances, beyond our audience's reach. So if you think about relationships, romantic relationships, it's even worse. It's all of those social cues and interactions that you can't read in people that you've just met, and then the complexity of romance and relationships on top of that. And it's a real struggle for people like James. What we see with this audience, and again, I just want to be clear that I'm not generalizing. I know that everybody's different and everybody functions at different levels. We've done focus groups, we've interviewed carers and support workers, and we've done user testing with our audience. So we're speaking in general terms. But one of the things we know from the studies that have been done is that our audience suffer from poor quality relationships. And I'll use James as an example. If anybody smiles at James or talks to him nicely, they are a close friend of his. He would consider them to be a close friend. And James has quite a few close friends, but they never call him. They never go to movies with him. They never invite him out when they have a party. And I understand why. It's sometimes, for somebody who loves him enormously, it's difficult to interact with him because he can talk about one topic, hours on end. And you really have to have a lot of patience and you really have to care a lot sometimes to stay engaged and to really give back to the relationship as much as he needs. And so with these poor quality relationships, we see a high instance in this audience of depression and social isolation. And again, if you add romance on top of that, it's just too much. It's incredibly difficult. And as a result, our audience tends to, on my screen, that's a much clearer heart, by the way. Our audience does tend to turn to online dating. And online dating does offer a number of benefits for our audience because there are fewer social demands. So if one of the things that you struggle with is physical cues or nonverbal cues, you don't have those in a digital environment. If you can't read somebody's body language, that's not an issue when you're doing online dating. More importantly, though, I think, is the slower pace at which you can manage these interactions. You can be very careful about how you communicate information about yourself, and you've got a lot more time to digest communication or information about other people and make up your mind and decide what you think, and you can take communication in your stride. And that's one of the reasons that online dating really is something that could be very beneficial to our audience. Now, some in our audience manage very well with mainstream dating sites, but we've also found that a lot of our audience really struggle because mainstream dating sites can come across as being very aggressive and very competitive. And if you take somebody that has a neurodisability who doesn't function in the same way as neurotypical people do, and you drop them into a pool of matches where, more neurotypical people are, it can be very difficult and it can feel very competitive. And it can also really exacerbate that sense of isolation and it's just not going to work for me. I'm just not cut out for this. And so in our focus groups, we've had a lot of anecdotal feedback from our audience that say once they tried online dating, they became more convinced than ever that they just couldn't get it right, that romantic relationships weren't for them. And we've seen a lot of people just resign to the fact that it's an aspect of their life that they're just never going to get right and that they're not going to enjoy. And so what we did was Samantha and I started a digital agency on our own, and we started working with a lot of startups and really helping them to define their audiences and to improve their offering and their experience design. And we just decided that this is something that we wanted to do for ourselves. We wanted to become our own clients, and this seemed like the perfect project because we really do have an opportunity to make a difference. We started My Favorite Hello, and it's an online dating site designed specifically to accommodate the condition of our audience. And what we aim to do is to improve the quality of relationships that they have, not just romantic relationships, but social connections and social relationships. We want to do that by providing more choice, by flattening social obstacles, and by creating support structures around romance and dating. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we're doing that. So when we think about choice, for our audience, introductions are few and far between. They meet lots of people, but getting to that next stage where there's a potential romantic connection, it very rarely happens to be in a position to take that further. And so the pressure on making that introduction a successful one is intense. And when you take the social obstacles that people face and you add pressure on top of that this has to be the date that works, this has to be the connection that goes somewhere because there might not be another one behind it. The fear and the terror going into that situation is crippling. And so one of the things that we aim to do as a digital service is really to make far more introductions than a lot of the specialist agencies are doing now. And a lot of those specialist agencies are offline where you've got, somebody in a small office with a flip chart who's making physical introductions. And there are some online services, but they're not understanding the challenges that our audience have and they face. And so what we want to do with our service is we want to make it really easy to sign up, really easy to give us a try. And our aim is to make 5 introductions a week. I know that it's a lot slower than a lot of the mainstream dating agencies do, but we also don't want to overwhelm people with too much choice, our audience with too much choice. But if there's an introduction and there's another one and another one and another one, it takes a lot of the pressure away from that one introduction being the one. And if it doesn't work, there's another introduction behind it. And if that doesn't work, there's another introduction behind that. And what that means is that for the first time, our audience really has choice. They don't have to make something work. And what that leads to is self-discovery. What do I want from a relationship? And what do I have to offer in a relationship? Because the more choice you have, the more discretion you can use, and the more you can think about what you bring to the table and what you need to take from somebody else. And so by having an easy sign-up process and by making multiple matches, we're making relationships more accessible, and we're giving people choice and helping them learn about what it is they want. The next thing that we want to do is flatten social obstacles. So we know that the biggest thing standing in the way of successful connections and successful relationships are the social obstacles that people face. And for a lot of our audience, and we've heard this feedback a lot, it feels so complicated that it feels easier to be alone. It's less frightening to think about a life not having had a successful or meaningful relationship than it is to think about actually going on a date and getting through all of those interactions and ending up with somebody for the long run. So what we've tried to do is to give our audience as much skill-building content as we can. And we know that we're a long way from having the kind of content that we need to really make an impact, but we've started and we're improving every day. And what we want to do is we want to talk audiences through the process of getting to know somebody and eventually having a successful relationship, one interaction at a time. The other thing that we've got is an on-the-date app that sits in our members' pockets when they go on a date, and it talks them through every single interaction if they need it. So right from to managing your emotions before you go on the date, coping strategies if you're feeling really stressed out or nervous, or if you're feeling really excited, reminding you not to overwhelm your date who could be feeling very nervous themselves, all the way through to a conversation SOS button. So if we have two people sitting at a table and they're struggling for conversation because they've got so many things they have to remember and so many rules they have to follow, hitting the conversation SOS button will scrape their date's profile and feed them topics of interest and tell them what their date's interested in, what they should be talking about. And ultimately what we want to do is gamify that process to make it even less awkward. But it really is kind of guiding people through the process. And then the other thing that we need to do is we know that with this audience, and particularly with our learning disabled audience, we need to be very careful about safety and a vulnerable audience behaving in a way that's not in their own best interests. And a lot of the pushback that we've had from investors to supporters that we've spoken to has been around the topic of safety, and it's not safe, and you've got predators who could potentially infiltrate the site. And our belief is that if we can teach people how to behave in a way that's in their own best interest in terms of safety, and the behaviors they need to look out for, and the red flags they need to see when they're communicating with somebody, we're equipping them not just to deal with matches on our site, but to really look for people who are predatory away from our site as well. And so it's really important that we build up that skill set, because where we might have an instinct for these sort of things, a lot of our audience don't have that instinct, but they can learn. And it's our goal to teach them. So with every single communication they get from us, there's a safety message. And when they communicate with somebody online, there's safety messages telling them what to look out for. And then finally, creating support structures. One of the things that we know is that our audience relies really heavily on their supporters. And supporters could be friends, families, but also care workers. And we know that our supporters are the biggest influences in our members' lives, and we don't want to cut them out of the process. We want to make sure that we can include them in the process, but we've got to be careful about too much inclusion and too much reliance. So what we want to do is create support structures where people can invite, or members can invite their supporters to be a part of this process if they want to. And we've got 3 levels of account. We've got a fully independent account for somebody, on the high functioning end who doesn't actually need the intervention or a supporter to be involved in the process at all. And we're very, very keen that people are independent. Or we have partially supported accounts where people can decide what information they share with their supporters. Or we have fully supported accounts where every communication that a member receives, their supporter would get a duplicate copy of that communication so that they can just keep an eye on how things are going. And that's really important to us because one of the things that we want to do is to promote independence. And so somebody can manage their account without having a supporter sitting next to them, knowing that their supporter is monitoring and approving of what's happening on the account as well. But one of the things we do know is that our members are far too heavily influenced by their supporters. And this is a problem because the supporters tend to be neurotypical and don't fully understand all of the challenges that our audience face. So it's really important for us to have an anonymous forum on the site as well, where we can create those peer-to-peer connections, where our audience can get recommendations and advice from people like them who understand the challenges they face, who've been in similar situations, who can share success stories, but also really importantly can talk about when things go wrong. Because we know with our audience there's an overdeveloped fear of rejection and sense of rejection. And that tends to manifest in real frustration and sometimes aggressive behavior. And rather than have that directed towards the failed match, we'd rather it happened on the anonymous forum where people can talk about their frustrations and the hurt that they feel when something doesn't work. Because it's really important that the community can self-support and kind of help with coping strategies and sharing the advice that they've had that's worked. And then finally, in looking at support systems, one of the things that we want to be able to do is turn a match into a friend. So just because a connection doesn't end up in a romance, it doesn't mean that that's not a valuable connection to you. And if you've met somebody that you have a connection with, but that chemistry is just not there, with our audience who have low quality friendships, we don't want to say, well, it's got to be a romance or nothing. So we want our audience to be able to turn a match into a friend so that there's no romantic pressure, but they're starting to build up that social network. And then you never know, in time, as they get to know each other, they could turn them back into a match and state their intent that way. But we know, one of the things we do know is that the more experience that our audience has socializing, the more comfortable they become and the more easily they can overcome those social obstacles. So it's really important for us that socializing happens on whatever level, although the ultimate goal will always be a romance. And that's just a kind of a teaser of the digital service that we offer. And all of that's brilliant and perfect, and we've been running for 5 months now, and we're really happy with the service that we have and the results that we've been able to achieve. But our biggest challenge to date, and it'll surprise you, it's the supporters. The supporters of our audience really underestimate our audience's desire for romantic relationships. They really downplay that desire. And a lot of that has to do with our members or our audience themselves. Because they feel so dejected and because they feel it's a goal that's too far away, they tend to downplay the importance that connection has to them. And so the supporters facilitate that. They become enablers and they step in and they fill that role and they make it okay to not want a romantic relationship. And that's a problem because we know that desire is there. The second thing is a lot of the advice, and as I say, this is a very, very influential relationship that a lot of our audience have. A lot of the advice is based on their own experiences. And I'll come back to James. James started to date somebody. And because we were so thrilled as his family that he was in a relationship, even though she wasn't right for him, we really pushed it. And we really highlighted all of her positive points. And we really, really encouraged him to stick it out and give it a try. And at the end of the day, he's very, very habit-driven. He's, very, very process-driven. He's not at all outgoing, and he's hugely resistant to change. And she was very outgoing, and she was very adventurous. And because we would like James to be more outgoing, we really pushed her. And eventually, he just said, she's not for me. But that was really difficult because he had to deal with the breakup, but also managing our expectations for him and how badly we wanted a relationship for him. And that added additional pressure, and that really put him off relationships moving forward. The other thing that we have with our supporters is the belief that online dating is unsafe. And a lot of that tends to be because supporters, and particularly care workers, are not digital natives. And they are not, transacting online all the time. They're not very comfortable transacting online. And there really is this belief that online dating is unsafe. And I'm not saying that it's not. But it's a regulated environment. And certainly a service like ours, we do everything we can to make sure that people who are signing up are genuine members. We will have automated processes put in place. And it's important to mention that because it's not that we think that nobody will ever get through. But what we have seen is that because services like this are not readily available for our audience, they tend to look for those relationships on social channels. And what we're seeing is they're indulging in far more risky behaviors on Facebook and Snapchat than they do in a regulated environment. And we had a care worker tell us that the person that she cared for genuinely believed that she was talking to Drake and that she was going to have a date with Drake and that, everything was going to be great. And fortunately, the carer was able to intervene at that point. But it's really important to recognize that nowhere is safe online, but in a regulated environment, we can reduce the risk of bad people getting in. And so the answer is really we have a job to educate supporters, to really help them understand how digital can empower this audience and how a digital service like ours and the content like ours can really help to learn or to teach these social behaviors. And the other thing that we have to do is just deliver on our promise to be a safe and friendly environment that fosters a sense of security and promotes confidence, that gives our audience the control over their romantic relationships. And I think that as we become a more established service, I'm hoping that we will deliver and there will be a greater degree of trust and less education will be necessary. And so in conclusion, I'd like to say that James is still single. So if anybody quite fancied his video in the beginning, you can hit me up afterwards and I'll give you his phone number. He's fabulous. Thank you very much.